Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I want to share my deep dive with the Flow Tarot by Rachel Torda. This is a pretty recent deck to my collection at the time of filming this first clip in early November. And I thought that this would be a good deck to share a bit of a deep dive process with. I made a video not too long ago, I'll link it below, about some ideas for a deck deep dive or what that could entail. So I thought it would be fun to then share some of that kind of in more like real time with a range of decks in my collection. And this is the first one of what I hope to be a bit of a deep dive playlist. So this is a deck that went on and off my wish list quite a few times this year. I feel like in some ways it's a real kind of obvious deck for me to have in my collection, given that, you know, if you know me or watch my channel, you know that decks like Naturescapes or Tarot of Architectural Objects, Majestic Earth, these kind of landscape imagery decks, including photography decks, are ones that I tend to really gravitate to. I'm also a Pisces, so water-themed decks also appeal to me. So this is kind of the intersection of several things that I like in a deck. I went back and forth, though, in terms of whether I wanted to add this deck to my collection for a couple of specific reasons. Mostly the fact that this deck has keywords or phrases on each card is something that I don't look for in a deck. And so watching other people's walkthroughs, I wasn't quite sure, you know, would I find the keywords distracting? Would it make the deck feel like more of an oracle to me? You know, not sure. And there's a bit of suit renaming that feels not intuitive to me, we'll say. So the suits in this deck are waves for wands, snow for swords, pawns for pentacles, and clouds for cups. These are, you know, they're fine. You know, in saying that they're counterintuitive to me, that is in no way a criticism of the, you know, the creator's decision making or anything like that. But in the context of my druidry practice, winter is associated with earth. So having snow, which for me is winter, in a suit that isn't the earth suit, which would be pentacles, is just a thing that I know will take some time to get used to, right? So I ultimately decided to add this to my collection because I started to feel like, well, if this is a deck I keep coming back to and I've written down on my list multiple times, clearly it's pulling to me for some kind of reason, so I should get to know it, and that made it good, I think, as a pick for a deep dive deck, because what I'm hoping to do through this process is to figure out exactly how this deck would fit into my practice, how I would work with it. Would I work with it more as an oracle deck, for example? So I have some ideas of how I'm going to get to know this deck that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. The place that I started with my deep dive that I didn't film, but I'll talk about now, is the slow flip through. So whenever I receive a deck, I do like to take the time, you know, first to do a quick check to make sure all the cards are present, and then a kind of longer flip through, just appreciating each image, right? Having a look, seeing what stands out, and frequently I'll write down different observations that stood out. So I wanted to share my flip through with you. I didn't film the actual flip through because this is not a deck that I'm particularly like quick to. It's been out for quite a while. There's plenty of great flip throughs and reviews on YouTube already. I don't need to kind of reinvent that. But I went through and I flipped through the deck and I took some notes for myself. And I did two things. One is I decided to categorize each card as I went through. And the categories that I used are titles versus keywords. So for each card, I considered whether the extra text on the card read to me like a title, like a name for the card, or like a keyword. And these feel quite different to me. To give an example, I'll give an example. I feel like, just looking through the deck and picking something, I would say the Strength card, just picking one, has the Quiet Power. And I would say that the Quiet Power is a title. The Quiet Power as a title doesn't, to me, suggest any particular way of reading this card. It doesn't skew positive. It doesn't skew negative. It doesn't function as any kind of affirmation. It is a title to me. It's descriptive, right? By comparison, I would say that something like the Five of Waves, which is Wands, that has flow around adversity. This I would call a keyword or key phrase, I guess, because it's more than one word. Flow around adversity feels like it's telling you to do something, right? It's giving you a particular interpretation in ways that something like the Quiet Power to me is not. I appreciate that this is entirely subjective, and somebody going through this deck thinking about keywords versus titles would probably come to a different kind of tally than I did. But I find this useful because I do experience kind of keyword decks and title decks in Oracle, for example, quite differently. And I'll share that I found in my flip through that this was very even. There was slightly more that I classified as keyword, but only like 2 more keyword than title. So I found this deck to have a lot of both. At the same time, when I was doing this flip through, I also wanted to consider the balance of the deck. So for each card, in addition to considering keyword versus title, I also considered positive, negative, or neutral based on the, again, the words on the card. For me, imagery, like nature-based imagery like this, is neither positive nor negative. To me, all of these are inherently neutral. Like there's not really to me a way to read them in any other way. But with key phrases, to me, that's not the case. So I tallied up positive, negative, and neutral cards, and out of the 78, I considered 19 cards to be positive, 7 cards to be negative, and 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 52 to be neutral. So the vast majority are neutral, and for me, this is a good thing. I like a tarot deck that doesn't feel too weighted in any particular direction. I don't think tarot as a system is weighted in any particular direction. I think every card, for me, has positive, negative, neutral, potential meanings and interpretations that might arise in the context of any given reading and any given question. So I like when a deck feels neutral in terms of its kind of overall balance, and I was happy to find in my flip through that this deck does meet that criteria. That's something that I like in a deck. The other notes that I made in my flip through, I noted that there are a couple of title changes in the majors in this deck. The one that would normally be the hanged one is the floating one, which feels pretty intuitive, Card 13 that would normally be death is darkness. And card 14 that would normally be temperance is balance. So balance feels a little bit prescriptive to me for the temperance card, but other than that, I'm fine with these. The majors for me overall, and I wrote down for each, the majors come out as pretty neutral, pretty balanced overall. And I wrote down with the exception of the world card. Most of the majors I found to be kind of titles rather than keywords, and to be quite neutral, except for the world card. And the world card has the phrase, "You are complete," on it. And I feel like "you are complete" is very affirmation sounding, right? So that feels less neutral to me than a lot of the others. I thought that the swords were more negative skewing, which, you know, a lot of decks do this, have a more negative feeling sword suit than the others. It's not my favorite thing. It's one of the reasons that I like pip decks, if anything. So the swords felt more negative than the others to me. And as an example, the 7 of swords having a what I would call keyword of deceiving. This is a very particular way of reading the 7 of swords. That's not frequently how I read it. So that kind of is part of why I struggle with keywords on tarot, right? Reading the 7 of swords as something other than deceiving when the word deceiving is right on it is a bit tricky, particularly I think when you're reading for someone else, right? Because someone's eye is going to go straight to that word and want to see it incorporated into the reading, which poses a challenge. I thought the wands leaned a little bit more positive. The pentacles leaned a little bit more positive, and the cups leaned a little bit more positive as well. So it really is just the swords that went kind of to the negative side of neutral for me in my flip through. I didn't write down too many things in terms of initial impressions, but I thought that the 4 of Pentacles, I want to think about this keyword choice more. The 4 of Pawns, which is the 4 of Pentacles, has the phrase on it, smoothest route. And smoothest route, or smoothest route, depending on how you say that, is not a phrase that I would think of for the 4 of Pentacles. So that's one that I need to think about as I explore this deck further. The other one that I wrote down, kind of feeling a bit head scratchy about, was the King of Cups, which is the King of Clouds, and the keyword is spiraling renewal. I can definitely connect spiraling renewal to this image. You know, the spiral is quite evident there. And, you know, renewal related to a storm, certainly, but for a King of Cups, spiraling renewal feels like a strange title to me. These are the things that I'm going to explore further in my deep dive process. So I'm looking forward to sharing further deep dive thoughts with you. But my initial flip through, I will say, you know, concluding thoughts, I'm happy that as I look through this deck, it does feel pretty balanced. It does feel pretty neutral overall in terms of kind of positive versus negative, in terms of the language used. That's, I think, going to help me with the fact that there are keywords on the deck. The artwork is beautiful. The artwork is beautiful, beautiful. I knew that I would love the artwork, and I do. And I'm interested to see the interplay of the titles and the keywords, what I'm thinking of as titles and keywords. So that's my initial thoughts. I will try to film each time I have a activity to share with you or to update how the deep dive is going. There'll probably be some weird lighting in this video. It is not the best weather here right now. The weather is ice balls falling from the sky. Everything is gray. It's hard to find a good spot to film. I'm in a different place than usual. But I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts on this deck with you. Stay tuned. So I've decided to share a deck interview spread that I did with the Flow Tarot. I performed this reading on November 12th, which is not too long after the deck came into my collection. And I've used a spread that I found via Beth Maiden of Little Red Tarot, but which Beth says is not an original creation, isn't sure kind of where she found it, but that she's often credited with it. So I got it from there. And it's a 6-position spread, as you can see. I often, in my kind of regular practice, draw more than one card per spread position, but here I just decided to go with one card each as I'm getting to know this deck. And I went in a simple couple of lines. So the spread positions kind of 1 to 3 are at the top, left to right, and spread positions 4 to 6 on the bottom there. And this is a spread, obviously, that I have already done, so I know what is under, these card backs. I know which 6 cards I got, but I thought that I would share, a bit of a walkthrough of that reading with you. So the first position is tell me about yourself. What is your most important characteristic? And the card that I drew for that is the floating one, which has the keyword there, between worlds. And this is the equivalent of the hanged one. The majors are not numbered in this deck. So the most important characteristic of this deck then is the floating one, between worlds. And between worlds immediately kind of evokes this kind of liminal, hedge kind of space. In terms of a water-themed deck, it makes me think of a seashore where land and water meet as a kind of hedge space or liminal space. And these kind of spaces, I think, are where, new perspectives can happen, or shifting perspectives can happen perhaps more easily as we kind of step outside of the everyday. And the idea of the floating one turning up, a card that we frequently see depicting someone upside down, I think that this makes a lot of sense, right? And this frog here is obviously an amphibian. A frog can see in, water and air, and can live partly in water and partly in air. And so I think that this deck then, as its most important characteristic, is a deck that kind of facilitates looking at things a little bit differently. And, taking perhaps a new perspective on whatever the topic of the reading is, and also perhaps tarot itself, since it's, obviously quite a non-traditional deck in its artwork. So, the most important characteristic. The second question in the spread is, what are your strengths as a deck? And for the strengths as a deck, I chose this card, which is the Ace of Clouds, and the keyword is overflowing. And in this deck, the Ace of Clouds is the Ace of Cups. And I had a bit of a laugh with this because obviously, the whole deck is water themed and its strength is overflowing, the Ace of Cups. I feel almost unsurprised to see that this card would show up here, suggesting to me that given the theme of this deck, that perhaps questions that we would think of as kind of watery in their nature, questions about feelings, about emotions, getting under the depths of emotions, are the types of readings then that this deck, I would think, would excel at. And, perhaps the kinds of readings that facilitate emotional growth with the Ace of Cups would be a type of reading that this deck would excel at. I also kind of got the impression then that in terms of strengths as a deck, being the Ace of Cups here, that how well this deck reads, or getting this deck to kind of read best for me, may come down to kind of letting myself follow the kind of emotional responses that I have to the imagery. And that may take me, in some cases I've noticed, in quite different directions than, something like the Smith-Waite connotations of any particular card. But I am finding, since I performed this deck interview and have used the deck for other things, that this does hold quite true, that following kind of the responses I have to the cards seems to give the best readings. The third question is, what are your limits as a deck? And for limits as a deck, I got the Hermit card. And you can probably see here that the Hermit card's title is The Unseen Connection. And the Hermit, I think, as a limit, which is different, I think, than a weakness, right? It doesn't pair strengths and weakness, strengths and limitation. or limit of the deck. Thinking about the Hermit as a limit, I feel like, insofar as the Hermit is a figure that I think of as a kind of wise, a wise figure. I think of the Hermit when I think of, Zarathustra coming down the mountain and figures like this. These kind of figures can be quite, prescriptive at times. Perhaps not Zarathustra so much, but certainly the kind of sage figure might be a prescriptive one. The Hermit card depicts someone holding up a lantern, lighting the way. And so insofar as this is a limitation, my first kind of thought on this card is the limit of this deck to do with kind of prescriptive and future-oriented, perhaps predictive as well, kinds of readings. If its strength has to do with, readings that explore the emotions, perhaps its limit is the more concrete side of reading in my practice, which does include things like predictive reading. I also thought of here, the fact that, for those of us who are not frogs, like this one, water is a medium that is hard to see through, right? To look very far ahead, at least unless you have some kind of goggles or something like that. It can be blurry or distortive to try to see far ahead of oneself in water, as the Hermit might see far ahead with a lantern, right? So that was my first thought for a limit for this deck. The fourth question is, what are you here to teach me? And the card that I got here ends up being a card that has actually turned up quite a bit for me with this deck, and that is the Chariot card with the keyword, the flow. The deck is here to teach me flow. And I find with this deck, sometimes the titles jump out more to me and sometimes they don't. I'm just kind of feeling my way through that suitably enough as far as this deck is concerned. I feel like as a lesson, this kind of card is a lesson. You can see there's a kind of dragonfly riding on a leaf here down a flowing stream. If this is a lesson, it feels like a lesson in ease and trust and willingness to kind of go with the flow as it moves us along. I feel like the kind of, lesson that this card suggests this deck is here to teach me is one that I struggle with, as someone who deals with anxiety in various kinds of ways. Being able to go with the flow is difficult. The Chariot, I think, can be a card that at times brings up questions that have to do with control. And, the extent to which one is able to steer things and, steer away from any kind of obstacle. And so as a lesson, this ultimately feels like one of, letting my mind stop racing a bit, letting myself just feel the flow and not try to steer too hard. And I think that that's an important lesson for me. And so I liked that turned up in this reading. The fifth question is, how can I best learn and collaborate with you? And I will say that the deck interview is something that somewhat challenges me at times as someone who does not kind of personify their decks. But I do think of reading, as a kind of collaborative, process between me and the cards. The cards are presenting me with something, that I then work from. So how can I best learn and collaborate with the Flow Tarot? The card that I got is the Two of Snow, here called the Path. I apologize for the weird lighting. I'm doing my best here. the Two of Snow, the Path, and the Two of Snow in this deck is a Two of Swords. How can I best learn and collaborate with this deck, the Two of Swords, the Path? And the first thing I noticed about this card, actually, when I was going through, is that we think of the Two of Swords, or at least I do, as a kind of analysis paralysis, perhaps, stuck between ideas that are pulling in different directions, the two swords kind of crossed and pointing in different ways, and this kind of stuckness to that, right? So how can I learn to collaborate with this? And this card here has a path. It has one path, right? This is not a Two of Swords that depicts a kind of crossroads, which one might perhaps expect more than this. It's a single path. And so my first thought with this, is how can I best learn and collaborate with this deck is by kind of embracing where it wants to lead me. It's giving me a way here, a way forward. And what does it mean to embrace that? And this ties in for me to the strengths of the deck relating to the Ace of Clouds or Cups, and, going with kind of emotional impressions of this deck, letting the deck lead. And, I can't see where this path leads, at least not very far here. It looks like it winds off perhaps to the right, but we can't really tell. And so like the Chariot card here with the flow, what the deck is here to teach me, this card of the Two of Snow and the Path seems to also speak to, the sense of trust and a sense of openness. Being open to where the reading leads me, even if it's a perhaps unconventional interpretation, for example. And so how can I best learn to collaborate with the deck then? By keeping in mind the deck's strengths, right? And what it's here to show me. So that's very interesting, I thought. And the final position is, what is the potential outcome of our working relationship? And the potential outcome of our working relationship, I got the Queen of Waves, Radiate Harmony, and a jellyfish here. And the Queen of Waves would be the Queen of Wands. And I feel like, the idea of harmony as a potential outcome of working with this deck, right, feels like a really nice end to this reading for me. I think that if there's any kind of creature that, exemplifies a kind of oneness with their environment, it must be something like a jellyfish, right? A jellyfish is mostly water. And it very much, flows with the water that it is in. And so if, here, finding harmony means kind of being like the jellyfish, so to speak, right? Knowing that one is where one is supposed to be. And harmonizing with one's environment. And flowing with one's environment. Like that as an outcome of working with this deck makes me feel quite optimistic. I've talked about previously on my channel that this is a deck that I went back and forth on quite a lot. Unsure of whether this would be a deck that would be one that would work well for me, even though, with it being nature photography, it very much is kind of my style aesthetically speaking, based on other decks that I like and use the most. There are aspects of this deck that I wasn't so sure about. Certainly the titles on the cards and the keywords on the cards, and even within its own system, some of these depictions are very unconventional, right? In the Suit of Waves, for example, you don't always have a depiction of waves. In the Suit of Clouds, you don't always have clouds. So even within its own kind of reworking of tarot structure, the cards still deviate quite a bit, which I think is quite interesting. And yeah, with this kind of interview, which is the first reading, that I performed with this deck, excluding kind of single card draws here and there, this feels very cohesive to me. This feels like a very cohesive reading with different positions in the reading reinforcing one another, right? The idea of the flow of the chariot being the lesson to learn, and the outcome of that, being feeling more harmonious, this seems to go together to me, right? The idea of best learning and collaborating with this deck by following, this path that the deck is laying out, getting out of that frozen sense and going along seems to go well with, even the kind of the floating one is the most important characteristic of this deck, being one that invites a new angle on things. So I quite enjoyed this spread. It's not something I do with every new deck in my collection, but I decided to here because I thought it would be a fun thing to share. If you do, deck interviews, let me know in the description, in the comments below. You know what I'm talking about. Let me know if you do deck interviews and whether you've done a deck interview with this deck. I'd be happy to hear. I am back with some guidebook inspired thoughts. I didn't necessarily think when I ordered this deck that I was going to be talking about gender, considering that it is a deck with no people in it that represents water and animals, but here we are. I want to talk about gender in the Flow Tarot and try maybe a bit of an experiment, a fun experiment, as part of this deep dive. So I've been reading some of the guidebook, and I haven't read all of the kind of card by card descriptions or anything, but I've been working on reading kind of the front part of the guidebook, kind of introductory content, and then the working with the deck content at the back. So there's kind of the intro, and then there's the working with the deck, and then in the middle of that is all the kind of card by card interpretations. That part I haven't read yet. Working with the deck, I'm a couple of pages into this section, and I've been going along so far so good, right? The author talks about changing some of the card names in the majors, talks about focusing on water and not including human depiction in the deck. So good. Talks about the decision to include animals in the deck, and I quite like some of what is said in that section. She writes, there are lessons for humans in how these animals learn to live at one with the various forms of the water element. And, talks about not including too many animals, to make it an animal deck, but just including them in a few cards. She talks about water not having a negative or a positive side, or being good or bad. Water being effectively neutral in ways that I like. And then we get to the part about gender, and of course I have problems. All right, I'm going to read from the guidebook verbatim to start, and we'll see where we go. There's a section here on page 119 called Keeping Gender in the Cards When Water Doesn't Have a Gender. And I read that subtitle and I thought, okay, the cards do have some kind of gendered titles, like kings and queens are kings and queens in this deck, empress and emperor, high priestess is a gendered title. So it's like, that's what I figure this is talking about, right? And I appreciated immediately the acknowledgement that water does not have a gender. Water is not gendered. It occupies all things fully, equally, and unconditionally. It does not lose its essence when it moves from a raindrop to a rushing river. It is still water, no matter what form it takes. But keeping gender in the card names is an easy way to understand the kind of energy at work in the cards, either individually or in balance with one another. The female gendered cards have more passive, encompassing, or gently flowing energy. The male gendered cards have more active, directed, or surging energy. Gender in the Flow Tarot becomes simply an expression of energy. Nope. So, so a couple of things, right? Initial thoughts when I read this, right? The subtitle is Keeping Gender in the Cards. This description does not say anything about keeping gender in the cards. It says something about keeping cis heteronormative binary understandings of gender in the cards. Those things are different, right? Binary hierarchical understandings of gender don't account for gender as such. So there's that, right? Then there's the kind of, female as passive and gentle, and male as active and surging. Okay? I'm just going to leave that there. And I think that my thoughts are fairly fucking evident, what I think of that. But I think that what's strange about this for me, I mean, besides the obvious, right? What's strange about this to me is that, like, I don't actually see this in this deck. So I took out all of the cards that, jump out immediately as having a gendered connotation in some way in terms of the titles on the cards. And I just want to talk about them because I don't see this active and passive, surging and gentle dichotomy that the book says is there, first of all, right? So just to discuss that, right? We have the Queen of Pawns. Pawns is pentacles. We have the Queen of Pawns as resourceful. And the King of Pawns as interconnected. Resourceful and interconnected. If one of those feels more active to me, I would say that it's actually resourceful. Resourceful means you're doing something. Interconnected, you could be actively fostering connection or you could not, right? If one of those words feels more active to me, it is actually the one on the feminized card of the Queen. Obviously, I don't think that interconnection or resourceful are gendered traits. Like, these are not traits that are in any way tied to any particular gender or gender expression. Anybody can be resourceful and anybody and anything can be interconnected, but there's that. Similarly, for the Queen of Clouds, we have compassion. And the King of Clouds, spiraling renewal. Neither of those feel passive to me. Or even gentle. I don't really necessarily think of compassion as passive and gentle. For Snow, the King of Snow, we have vision. And the Queen of Snow, we have clarity. Clarity. So, between vision and clarity, neither of these are terms that I would think of as being kind of normatively gendered or associated with any particular gender or gender expression in any way. Vision and clarity both feel very neutral to me, and certainly there's nothing gendered about mountains or about, some snow. And this bear, I mean, polar bears are not exactly sexually dimorphic from a picture like this, so, right? The waves. King of Waves is brave any depth. Beautiful whale there. I'm not going to speculate about the whale's gender. I wouldn't know. And the King of Waves, now I'm not finding. Where did I put? Okay, King of Waves and Queen of Waves. King of Waves is brave any depth. See? The patriarchy is confusing. The Queen of Waves is radiate harmony. Okay? These don't feel like gendered terms to me either. And then from the majors, we have the High Priestess, which is the gift. I would say gift giving, gift receiving, and gifts as such are fairly gender neutral as a phenomenon. The Empress is the abundant source. Okay. and the emperor is the vast network. Again, I don't see what the guidebook is talking about. I don't see it there. And I'm going to be honest, I'm really glad that I don't. Because I think the idea of imposing, normative and restrictive gender binaries on something as, not gendered as water would be strange, and the guidebook does begin that section noting that water is not gendered, right? So I don't see it. This also had me thinking about another book that I read recently. And I shared this book in one of my monthly updates, and that's Sacred Gender by Ariana Serpentine. The subtitle is Creating Trans and Non-Binary Spiritual Connections. And I really liked this book. You can watch my October summary for more thoughts on it, but I like this book. And there's a section in the book with an exercise called What is My Gender? And I want to read a little bit about this exercise, What is My Gender, from Ariana Serpentine's book, and then I want to connect it back to the Flow Tarot, because my brain, my gears are turning here. Okay, so what is my gender? This is from Sacred Gender, page 24. Get a paper and pen to write or draw with. Sit in a comfortable position with closed eyes and breathe for a minute to ground and center yourself. Now, without using the words masculine, feminine, male, female, man, woman, boy, girl, or any similar themed words, describe your gender. What is it? What does it feel like? What is it shaped like? How does it make you feel? Write or draw whatever comes to mind for your own sense of gender, including if it is nothing or absent. It can be as beautiful and poetic or as short and terse as you like. You're describing a very personal part of yourself. Only you know how to express it best. Most people find this difficult. This set of binary definitions has been used to define everything from body parts to clothing styles to modes of speech to carrots to houses. In languages with binary pronouns, animals and objects are frequently assigned male and female pronouns. However, I've noticed a very particular trend. Whenever I ask this question, the answers that I tend to receive from non-binary folks are extremely poetic. My gender is the sound of the wind in the trees at night. My gender is a possum screaming at their own tail. My gender is that feeling you get when the coffee wears off, but sometimes it's the feeling you get when it first hits you. I'm gender fluid, get it? My gender is bees. Most people who aren't familiar with non-binary folks will assume these answers are facetious, and honestly, in a few cases, they are an attempt to express frustration at a task that's made difficult by the constraints of the system we're taught to think in. Much of the time, though, these answers are an attempt to put words to a feeling. It's poetic self-expression. My thesis in dealing with gender is that gender identity is an expression of the self. Okay? And it goes on from there. So I started to think about this. It's like these phrases that Ariana Serpentine talks about non-binary folks kind of using to describe their gender. And I've heard lots of these before. I've never really sat down and thought about my own kind of fluctuating gender feelings in quite that poetic of terms. But I thought it would be fun to do so, since I have here a deck full of poetic keywords and titles. Can I find something, that feels gender affirming in this, Flow Tarot full of what I read as non-gendered language? Maybe. I feel like, and I'm just flipping through the deck in order here, and picking things that jump out, because I thought it would just be a fun thing to do. And maybe this won't end up in the deep dive video. I don't know. We'll see how personal this becomes. The Endless Waters? How amazing is that for an expansive way of thinking about gender? It can take on many shapes. The Flow? The Flow feels like a good description of how I experience kind of fluctuations, I would say. That's good. The inner reflection. I feel like this, exercise, the way that Ariana Serpentine talks about it, is about kind of trying to find language that reflects what's inner, right? So inner reflection as a kind of way of thinking about gender identity in the way that Serpentine thinks about it, I think is really interesting. The floating one, if you know what a floating signifier is, maybe the floating one, maybe my gender is the floating one. That would be good. The transformation. This is kind of fun. You are complete, I feel like, is a good affirming thing to remind ourselves when, we are faced with things that don't include us or suggest that we are not complete, right? I feel like sometimes gender feels like a ripple of energy. Maybe. There's you know what? There's a lot in here that I like. There's a lot in here that I really like. Sanctuary. I feel like I want my gender to delight in adventure. That feels like freedom to me. Delighting in adventure. And trying new things. Crystallizing moment. Any particular presentation, just crystallizing a moment and a kind of inner landscape that could be very different the next day. Overwhelmed. Maybe. Emerge is a good kind of gender self-discovery word. I like that. I feel like, embracing change. Thinking about coming to, what do I want to say? Coming to a point of being happy with sitting in the flux, and not needing to feel like I need to pin down identity language that I expect to be lifelong or permanent. Is very liberatory, I think. Carved by time. That's a good one. Carved by time. I feel like my gender queerness is boundlessly curious. That's good. The boundless curiosity of an otter. Why not? Against the flow. Yes, all of these things. This is kind of fun. Okay. I feel like I could go on for a while here, but I hope that this kind of makes sense. I'm not taking this too seriously, obviously. I could, but for this purpose, not really. But I thought that this would be a fun exercise anyway. And think about. I really like this activity from Ariana. If you've never done this, think about ways to describe your gender without using gendered language and see what you come up with. It's a frustrating but also really fun activity to try. So not one that I necessarily expected to be doing with the Flow Tarot as part of the Flow Tarot deep dive, but there you go. You know, the deep dive I feel like always yields some interesting connections. So something I thought would be important to address in a deep dive with this particular deck is the suits and the suit renamings. I've mentioned, you know, in previous videos that the suit renamings are one of the features of this deck that kind of kept me from getting it sooner. There are aspects of them that are not intuitive to me, you know, at first glance. I also think, you know, it's an interesting question, and it's a question that came up in the comments of one of my other videos about how kind of elementally balanced 4 minor arcana suits can feel in a deck when the deck is really themed around one of the 4 elements. And many of us read the minor arcana in a fairly elementally based way, so I think it's a good question to address. So here we have all of the aces, and the waves starting on the left are wands, the clouds are cups, the snow is swords, and pawns are pentacles. So what you get is a kind of alliterative reminder of which one's which, with the first letter of each one matching, you know, the W, the C, the S, and the P for wands, cups, swords, and pentacles. Something that you notice right, you know, off from the beginning is that the suit names do not reflect, you know, at least not in all cases, what is depicted in the card. So here, for example, in the Ace of Clouds, we have a, you know, surface of a body of water. There are no clouds in this image. And this is not an anomaly. We'll see throughout the minors that there are quite a few where the suit name is not something that is reflected in the imagery anyway. What I thought would not work for me in terms of the suits before I got this deck is that for me, clouds are very clearly airy. You know, if you think about how to reflect water that's in the air, probably the first thing you think of is clouds, right? So clouds, to me, instinctively, I want to make swords because they're the kind of airiest form of water. Snow, for me, I would instinctively want to make the earth suit or pentacles because in the context of my druidry practice and kind of my practice more generally, winter is associated with earth, right? Not with, like winter being associated with earth would suggest to me that snow, which only where I live comes in the winter, would be in the earth suit as opposed to the water suit, which is associated with autumn. Though it is autumn right now and we do have snow. So that's not, you know, a total impossibility, but I do think of snow as a wintry thing. Waves, I think, works perfectly. Pawns feel more like cups to me than pentacles. So I had kind of thought at first, well, what if I just read it the way that I want it to be? What if I just decided for myself reading this deck that clouds are going to be swords, right? I very quickly have come upon the conclusion that that will not work because the imagery is really well chosen. The imagery is really well chosen and well created for each of the cards. So I can't just decide, for example, that the clouds for me are going to be swords because, you know, sharing space, or shared space rather, doesn't really feel much like a Two of Swords, right? But for a Two of Cups, absolutely. And that really is the case, you know, throughout. Perhaps waiting could be a Four of Swords, but they really do feel more cups-like. So that was, you know, something to learn when I got this, deck. I will share that the guidebook does have explanations for why each was chosen. you know, besides the lettering, which is obviously a part of it. So for each, it does have a little section here about the choice. So here we see for waves, salt water makes up the wave suit. The waves represent action, movement, and innovation, initiative, drive. Where the wand suit is connected to fire, the waves are unified by the spark of action. The colors in this suit reflect the colors of the ocean, with emerald greens, coral oranges, deep sea blues, and storm grays. So for the most part, it's not a very fiery color palette, but I think waves and wands do work well together. Pawns for pentacles here include fresh water, include resources, stability, and practicality. Okay. And it notes where the Pentacles suit is connected to Earth, the Pawns cards are united by the energy of groundedness. And the colors in the suit reflect the colors of land. Okay. Snow for swords. We see that swords here are conceived of as representing challenges, clarity, resilience, and the connecting thread being stark clarity around decision making, as freezing temperatures force humans and creatures alike, humans are creatures, sorry, to cut to the heart of the matter and take action. And then finally, last, we have clouds. And for clouds, rain, clouds, mist, and rainbows make up the clouds suit, all types of water that come from the sky, representing emotions. The job of clouds is to hold water, so they act as cups to the water element. Again, I would totally think of clouds as air, not water, but the images, I think, work. The images work well. Now, look at each of the suits maybe. What you're not going to get with this deck, and you know, maybe this is something that is important to you, or maybe it isn't. What you're not going to get is the sense that some decks give of being almost color-coded, right? There is some degree of shared palette across the suits, but it's not, the suits are not, I don't think, distinctive enough in their color palettes that you would immediately see, for example, wow, I just pulled 4 cards and they're all wands, right? I don't think that the distinctions jump out in quite that way, okay? And you know, you can see here again, I mean, the extent to which some of these even depict waves is fairly limited. I would say these few certainly do not. But what I think really works in the minors is how well, again, the imagery is chosen. This feels very much like an 8 of Wands card to me, even though it is, of course, underwater, which might make us think water like the whole deck, but this feels very much like an 8 of Wands. Endure and like the age of this spiral for a 7 of Wands makes complete sense to me, right? So I think that these are really effective in conveying the meanings of the cards, if not completely jumping out as their respective suits. And in the courts we get animals. They're one of the only places that we get animals in this deck is court cards. There's a very few in the majors as well. And I really like the animal choices in the wands here. So the waves to me work well as wands. The clouds for cups we can look at next. Okay, so again, you know, the guidebook talks about all water that comes from clouds. So in the ace and the 3, we get a sense of raindrops falling onto a body of water, but we don't see clouds or mist, even though the cards do say clouds on them, whereas in the 2 and the 4 and in many of the others we do. This again, you know, it may bother some people. It doesn't bother me because I do think that the pictures work. Overflowing as an Ace of Cups makes complete sense to me. For example, even though there is no cloud there. And again, you know, this 8 for an 8 of Cups, thinking about changing direction as the phrase suggests, or moving away from something, this kind of image of migration, perfect. I think that really works. I think 6 of Clouds or 6 of Cups as wonder is a really effective choice as well. And here we get all cards that depict clouds. Most of them do, again. I really like this Knight of Cups. I think that this is very effective. I like the rainbows. I like seeing the rainbows in the 10 here and in the Knight as well. I think that this feels like a cup suit. And here in the, you know, here we have fewer. We only have one animal in the, I don't think there's any other birds in there. We only have one animal really strongly depicted in the cups. But I think that works. I still think spiraling renewal is a strange phrase for the King of Clouds, but I like the image a lot. If any of these stick out to me as not feeling like a Clouds Court card, it's definitely, unsurprisingly, the one that doesn't have a cloud in it. But you can see there's, you know, some degree of shared color palette, but it's not super strict, right? So you're not going to get the sense of kind of very visually jumping out at you distinctions between suits. I like this as a water suit though, so I'm over my initial trepidation that that this wouldn't work because I would think too much of clouds as air rather than water. I'm having read with this deck for a while now, past that concern. We can look at the, what's next? Snow for swords. I like the snowflake and crystallizing moment as an ace. I think of any of the suits that the swords or the snow suit feel the most cohesive to me. They have a very, you know, strongly shared color palette. There's a lot more purples in there than the others. So I think that these are quite cohesive as well. I'll mention another concern that I'd had with this deck, and, you know, I didn't even think about it until after I received it. I was reading in the guidebook very early on, discussion of the creation of this deck. And somewhere in the guidebook that I'm now not going to be able to find, of course, because I'm looking for it. That's probably at the end. The artist is talking about creating the deck. Right, here we go. Work with the deck section. And the artist writes that all of the images were chosen and many of them specifically created to fulfill the connection between the card's meaning and an image of water on Earth. The deck is not an artistic rendering, instead made of photos and photorealistic digital art so that you can imagine becoming a part of this real place on our planet. And I will say that in these times in which we find ourselves, the language of photorealistic digital art gave me pause and a little bit of concern that I might have bought AI, which is not the focus of this video, but suffice to say, I'm not buying AI decks, and I aim to avoid that. I didn't realize quite how long this deck had been out, but I did message the creator and she said absolutely not. That this is a deck that is created with photography, and the digital art referred to is things like Photoshop and, putting, for example, different trees on different backgrounds and blending them in, things like this, not generating imagery, from typing in prompts. So I was very happy to learn about that. That's a detour from the snowsuit. So the snowsuit, that's fun. So the snow was another one that gave me pause when I first was looking at this deck, because winter to me is earth. But again, the images work. I think that this, for a 3 of Swords, does something really interesting with locked in ice without being an impaled heart. For example, I think that it works. I think Accept Stillness as a 4 of Swords works really well. These really do make sense, I think. One of the few animals that is not in a court card there. I think that snow works for the stuckness of the 8 of Swords really well. Deceiving, this is one of the keywords that I like the least in this deck, because I think that it just skews too much in one particular way of reading this card, but I really like the image a lot, for sure. I really like this little bird for the 6 of Swords. So I like the kind of visual story that this deck gives in this suit. It feels very cohesive, and it does with the kind of amount of white in this suit. It does actually feel more airy than I thought it would. So I'm won over on the snow being air instead of earth, as I would have initially wanted it. I really like this polar bear. As a kid, polar bears are my favorite animal, so I was happy to see that there. And last, we'll just look at the pawns, which is the pentacles. Got them a little bit out of center there. There we go. The pawns also has a fairly earthy color palette, I think. There's a lot more kind of dirt and leaves in the pawn suit than any of the others, I think. And again, I think the imagery really works, right? For the pentacles. The 4 of Pentacles smoothest route is one that threw me when I first saw it. It's not something I would think of for the 4 of Pentacles, smoothest route, but the guidebook does give an explanation for this, right? About water flowing around obstacles and finding a path of least resistance. Look for ways around the people or situations that snag your energy. Hold too tightly and you might end up blocking yourself. That I can connect absolutely to the 4 of Pentacles. So that gave some insight into the choice. Again, this deck is very deliberate and very precise in terms of the choices that the creator has made, and working with it, I really appreciate that very much. Very well curated and well created, I think. Imagery really tightly around a theme. The 5 of Pentacles for scarcity, having a kind of drought or desert, I think is such an interesting choice. I've drawn the 6 and 7 of Pentacles several times. I really like this kind of curving 7 of Pawns. I think that that's a really interesting one. And the 8 of Pentacles carved by time, this idea of kind of repetition and, practice that can often be included in the 8 of Pentacles. I think that that's a really interesting choice of how to depict that. Again, another animal that's not in a court. Most of the animals are courts, but not all. We see one in the 9 here for safe harbors, which I think is a beautiful phrase for pentacles, for a 9 of pentacles, the garden, right, of safety. Oasis, a place that feels like home, for the 10 of Wands. And, I mean, an otter for the Page of Wands. I love that. And so, that's the Pentacles suit in the Flow Tarot. So I do think that the artist is quite successful in giving a sense of distinction between the suits, even though the theme of the deck is one specific element. So I wanted to share some thoughts about the guidebook for the Flow Tarot. It is a guidebook that comes with the deck, so it's not a kind of thing that you have to think about whether you want to purchase separately, but it might be a factor in, you know, someone's decision making of whether or not they'd like to work with this deck, so I figure it's worth discussing a bit. It is, in my mind, not really necessary to work with this deck well. I think that the deck reads well without the guidebook, but I do think that there's some interesting ideas and content in the guidebook that would be, you know, worth knowing about in the context of a deep dive video like this. So I thought I'd just kind of go through the table of contents and share some general thoughts. I have not read the guidebook cover to cover. Instead, what I've done is read the introduction section, which includes sections on making a tarot only about water, connecting with the deck, and spreads. And then the section at the end called Working with the Deck, which includes about the Flow Tarot, deepen your connection to water, water rituals. In between those two sections, there's a section on the major arcana and the section on the minor arcana, and kind of card by card write-ups for each. I haven't read every single card write-up, but I've read enough of them to feel like I can give you a good sense of what the book is like. So the front matter of the book, we'll say, explains the suit renamings. It explains how you might use the guidebook and how you might expand your perspective as you're working with the deck. And it includes 3 spreads. Find Your Flow, past, present, or future spread, an Ocean of Potential spread, which it lists as being a kind of weekly or monthly one, and then a full moon spread. They range from 3 to 5 cards, so they're fairly small, you know. I think that the past, present, future, you know, does any guidebook need that at this point? I would say no. It is nicely reworded to refer to the watery theme. It's not something we really need. The weekly or monthly spread is 5 cards, and I think is a good, a good one if you're looking for a general spread in terms of, you know, what's going on in the given period of time or what might be going on, what to focus on, what you don't need to focus on, these kinds of general questions. I think that it's a good one. And I think the full moon spread is a 3-card spread that is clearly informed by, you know, an understanding of associations with the full moon, so would be a nice one to try as well. I don't think the spreads are revolutionary, but I think that they're fine. Then it goes into the card by card. And there's a couple of things that stand out for me about this. One is that the majors and minors get something close to the same amount of text, which is really nice. So the majors, what you get is a full page and the full image beside. The minors, the image is smaller, but you still get almost a full page of text. It's a fair amount. So I do like about this guidebook that the minors haven't been given kind of lesser attention. I think that that's a good thing. I like about this guidebook and the card by card descriptions that they're very focused on the imagery in the card itself. I think it demonstrates how deliberately chosen and created the artwork in this deck is. And I think that, nothing bugs me more about a guidebook having card by card meanings than when they're really generic and they don't refer to the deck at all, right? For a deck that is specifically themed like this one, with as non-traditional art as this has, I want to see what this guidebook is giving, right? So to just take kind of an example, picking a page at random, right? The 7 of Waves, which has an image of a shell on it. The first sentence, the ridges, pockmarks, gouges, and missing chips on this spiral shell all tell a story, right? And it really gives you a good sense going forward from there why this particular image is on the 7 of Waves or the 7 of Wands, right? It gives a clear line of connection between the imagery and the meaning that is being put forward by the author as the meaning of that particular card. I think that that is really good and really important, and I wish every deck guidebook did it. The cards also come each with an affirmation. So the affirmations are kind of separated out on the page here. You can see at the bottom. Okay. So 2 of Waves or 2 of Wands, my energy pushes me ahead. Judgment card, I move forward with love, and so on. And I think that these could be something that someone would use with this deck if you wanted to do something like a daily 1-card draw, right? You could do a 1-card draw and then have that as your affirmation for the day. I'm very, very glad that the affirmations are in the book and not on the cards themselves, because I think that if they were on the cards, the deck would immediately be in oracle territory, kind of regardless of the intentions. But they're nice. They are supportive. They don't feel kind of overly sweet, but they, are positive. I'm adaptable. I share abundance. I open my arms to change. I breathe in stillness. They're good kind of daily affirmations, I think, if you wanted to use your deck in that way. Towards the end of the book, we have a section on water rituals, and I think that this is quite well done. It is a kind of bullet-pointed list of ways to connect with water, to explore water. They are, for the most part, very accessible, even if you don't live near a large body of water, for example. There is the one suggestion to, of course, go to a body of water and connect with the water where you live, but there's a lot of other options that don't presume that there is a natural body of water where you live, right? There's suggestions to observe the weather, to, think about the water that you drink every day. They're good, and I think that the rituals would, though they're not necessarily very explicitly framed in this way, I do think that several of them would support becoming more environmentally conscious around some of the issues with water and water pollution, and the importance of safe water, to drink and to use for other things. I think that this would be something that could support gaining that understanding and gaining that awareness, even though it's not the focus. I like that about those rituals as well. If I was going to criticize the guidebook in some way or offer a critique of the guidebook in some way, other than the issues with the gender that I've already mentioned, I would say that I wish that the book did have a bibliography. I don't think that the meanings of the cards, all require extensive citations or anything like that. I like the way that they're written, but I do think that when you have a guidebook that is bringing in sentences like, studies show XYZ about water, for example, you need to cite that, right? That is making a kind of factual claim. And if a study, if a study states something, if studies repeatedly state something, I would like to know kind of where those studies are from. So that would be the one thing that I think I wish was included that isn't. But a lot of the content would not require citations. I'm less bothered by it in this guidebook than I am at a lot of other books. If you watch my book reviews on tarot books or other reviews on tarot guidebooks, you'll know that if there isn't a bibliography, I will generally always say that I wish that there was one. This is no exception to that, but I also don't necessarily think that it would be, you know, I'm not as bothered by its omission here as I am in some other instances. It would be nice to have some kind of suggested further reading about water, for example. But all in all, I think that the guidebook is a good companion to the deck. I think that the card meanings do a good job of connecting the artwork, you know, to the card, to the associations with the card. And I think that the ritual suggestions are accessible and well thought out. Now, I know that I am far from alone in enjoying pairing decks and reading with multiple decks in a single reading. So I wanted to share some of the pairings that I have so far liked with the Flow Tarot. There are quite a few, and I think that this is a deck, you know, that would work well with a lot of other decks in a reading. I certainly have found that other photography-based decks that I love, like Naturescapes or Tarot of Architectural Objects, for example, tend to pair well really with a lot of different oracles. And I think that this one is no different. So the first I want to show is my own deck, an Arboreal Ogham, which is also photography based. All of my pairings are going to be with Oracle because I don't read with multiple tarot decks in a single spread, so pairing tarot with other tarot is just not a thing that I really think about. I think that this deck and my deck look really nice together. You know, so bringing a kind of earthy energy of the tree depictions of the Ogham to a reading with this very watery deck, I think, you know, is a good pairing. And I think Ogham and tarot work together as a kind of general rule. So I was unsurprised to find that these two worked well together in daily draws. I do a daily draw picking 2 tarot and 1 oracle, so that is the context in which I've been playing around with different pairings for the Flow Tarot, and this is one of the first ones that I tried. I think the first one that I tried, and of course immediately felt like this was a great match. So my deck is an option for pairing, and an Arboreal Ogham is on Make Playing Cards. I also decided to try some pairings of this Watery Tarot with some decks that are watercolor. So I did try pairing this for daily draws with the Morning Calm Oracle. And I think that the watery deck and the watercolor, of course, you know, work nicely together. I came up with some really like visually harmonious and beautiful pairings between these two decks. And I've found that when I'm reading with the Flow Tarot, I don't tend to go to the guidebook. I don't tend to go read the card meanings very much, but the Morning Calm Oracle is a deck that I do like to read the guidebook message when I pick a card. So that's a nice pairing for a daily draw, to have kind of the 2 tarot, 1 oracle, and then read the book that goes with this one. I think that that's really good. And the colors look really good together, I think. So that's the Morning Calm Oracle as another pairing idea. Another watercolor deck that is in my collection that I think looks really nice with the Flow Tarot is the deck for Wonder Walking by Amy Wan. This has quite a similar color palette in a lot of ways to the Flow Tarot. And these to me are just totally dreamy together. Lots of greens and blues in Wonder Walking. I'm waiting right now. Amy had a campaign for another printing of this deck, the deck for Wonder Walking, and I backed it because there's a new book that is a kind of nighttime walk theme. So I've been playing with this deck in anticipation of getting that new night walk book that I'm very much looking forward to. Similarly, these, I think these work because the deck for Wonder Walking also has, a handful of animals interspersed throughout. It's not an animal deck, but it does have, that bit of animal presence as well. It feels watery with the watercolor. I think that these really work. And it's interesting to have a tarot with a keyword on it, which is not what I usually go for in a tarot, with also an oracle with a keyword, because then you can, think about kind of dissonance or harmoniousness between the two. So I really like this kind of single keyword to go with the Flow Tarot as well. So that's deck for Wonder Walking. Of course, I wanted to try my water-themed oracle decks with this tarot, so I think a really obvious, mass market pairing option would be the Sea Soul Journeys, which is also, water themed and also nature photography. It feels like a lot of water to put these together. But I think, the colors look great. I think that the fonts don't totally clash, which is nice. I do prefer the font in the Flow Tarot by a long ways. This is a bit typewritery for my taste, but I think the colors work. And I think for a couple of tarot and an oracle, so how I'm reading for myself every morning, these have been a nice pair. The Sea Soul Journeys is for the most part, like this is a deck that I would really only do like a one card draw now that I've been using it for a while, so pairing it with a tarot is nice. And I think that this obviously, visually there's a lot of, is complementary, I think. A option for another mass market oracle that could go with this deck that is not photography but is water themed is one of my favorites. And this one is Laura Bowen's deck, the Saltwater Reading Cards. This is a deck that was my friend Katie Flowers made me do it, who loves these decks, and I love this deck. And this is another one like the Morning Calm where I really like to read the guidebook. Like pick one card and read the guidebook. So as part of a kind of morning routine, a few tarot and one of these with then the guidebook message for the day has been a really nice nice pairing, I think. And these two I think work because with the dot paintings in the Saltwater Reading Cards, it makes, this to me feels less kind of samey, repetitive than this one. This feels like more of a range and like complementary, but not repetitive. This one also has more animals, the Saltwater Reading Cards, which is nice, and messages that are more related to those animals. So I enjoy this deck very much. Okay, and then the last water-themed oracle from my collection that I've tried this deck with is a very special one that I absolutely intend to be the subject of a future deep dive video, and that is the Great Lakes Oracle. So this is like my local water, but it's also the land around the Great Lakes and the creatures who live in the Great Lakes. And I think that these are beautiful together as well. I think the colors work really nicely together. And again, this is one that also is a guidebook read for me. The guidebook for this is good. Look at how beautiful this is. To me, these go really well together. This is one of my favorite pairings. And I can see this deck perhaps, being of less interest to folks who don't live around the Great Lakes. It is very, very locally specific in many of its cards. Obviously something like Moon, not so much, but there are very specific landmarks in here and very specific kind of plants and animals that have very particular connotations if you live in this region, right? But I think that this is great. And this is another deck for me to pair my Great Lakes Oracle with that isn't the Great Lakes Tarot, which is good because I like the Great Lakes Oracle and Tarot together. Obviously, they're kind of a natural, obvious pairing, but I also think they both, are amenable to be paired with other things, right? So this is one of my favorites, I think, to pair. But now, as a last suggestion, you might choose to pair this with something that isn't watery in order to kind of balance it out in some way. So I thought of if I was going to pair this with an earthy deck as an example, you could pick something like Maggie Black's Tree Whisperer Oracle, which is also manipulated photography. So it has a shared medium. This is definitely more abstract, whereas the Flow Tarot, while there has been a fair amount of editing in some of the cards, like this one, the Hermit, for example, it's very much photorealistic, whereas this one, the symmetry of the trees, the way that it's been edited to look, like faces, feels more otherworldly to me. Whereas the Flow Tarot is very much like these are pictures of places that exist. They're both pictures of places that exist, but this is more fantastical, and deliberately so. And these feel like a very harmonious pair to me. So I think as well, I'm going to stop here with the pairings, but I think that the Flow Tarot you could pair with a lot of different animal decks. If you wanted to pick something less watery, you could pick something like the Birds Oracle, for example. But I also think, Animal Allies or kind of any decks like that could be a good option. I think Jessica Bott's Phenomena deck, that's the weather themed Oracle, could be a cool pairing for the Flow Tarot that I haven't tried yet, but I instinctively think would be interesting. I think you could pair something like Kelly Fitzgerald's Oracle of Place. Might be an interesting one to go with this. Or Journey Oracle, since that one is watercolor. So I think that it is amenable to all different kinds of pairings. If you have any particular pairings that you really like to use with this deck or that you think would work really well with the Flow Tarot, do let me know in the comments below. So now that I've been working with the Flow Tarot for a number of weeks, maybe more than that even, maybe a month, I thought that I would share some kind of final thoughts. Of course, they're never final thoughts as I continue to work with the deck and explore the deck. I'm sure I will have other thoughts that may, be shared in future kind of videos and in other contexts. But for the time being, I wanted to give a bit of a kind of sum up of the kind of things that I've figured out about this deck and my practice with this deck going forward from this deep dive time that I've spent with it. I will say that something I am happy to share at this point is that a lot of my initial reasons for not being sure about this deck, reasons for second guessing putting it on my wish list, reasons for being not sure if it would fit into my practice, turned out to be kind of unfounded. I wasn't sure about the suit renamings, for example. There are aspects of it like I would have done differently, but it's not my deck, so it's fine. But it reads well and it reads like a tarot. I wasn't sure if with the, the suit rename combined with having titles or keywords on the cards, if that would make the Flow Tarot read more like an oracle for me. And I'm happy that that's not the case. It definitely reads like a tarot deck. I think if you wanted to use the flow tarot like an oracle, if you wanted to have a single card draw for an affirmation, for example, you could. I think that the guidebook would support that kind of a practice, but I do think ultimately that it is faithful to the structure of a tarot deck, and so it reads like one. So I was happy to find that. I do prefer a deck not to have keywords, but I will say, there are a few decks that have been in my collection for a very long time that I love, that I use frequently, that do have keywords on them. When it comes to a deck like the Next World Tarot, I just try to ignore them. I think about chopping them off quite frequently. But a deck like the Wildwood Tarot, it has keywords on it, but it's very much its own system. I think that the titles of the cards being on the Wildwood are not a problem for me. They're not a distraction. If anything, I think that they do enhance the deck. I don't say that very often because keywords aren't my preference, but I think it is possible. I think with this deck, some of them are more effective for me personally than others. I mentioned in my initial kind of flip through thinking about some of them more in terms of titles and others more in terms of keywords. A title like, for example, the Empress being the abundant source. This feels like a title. It doesn't skew interpretation so much in a particular kind of direction, whereas something like overwhelmed on the Nine of Snow, this feels more like a keyword to me insofar as it suggests a particular kind of meaning, right? And in some cases suggests kind of either a more positive or a more negative slant. I do prefer the more neutral reading ones and the more, what I would call titles overall. And there's a lot of that in this deck, so I'm happy about that. I find the inclusion of these kind of title/keywords not distracting to my reading, and I have enjoyed working with this deck, so I'm glad that that kind of trepidation was something that I got over. I've been using this deck in the context of a class that I've been taking over, much of the time that's kind of overlapped with my deep dive of this deck. I've been in a Magic of the Moon class with Stars Dance Mystery School where we follow, the trajectory of a moon cycle, and we have, some Zoom sessions, and we explore how we're experiencing the moon cycle and different forms of magic to use alongside the moon cycle and so on. And one of the things that I've been doing in the context of that class is very small, kind of 3-position tarot spreads at the different phases of the moon. And I've been using this deck for that, and I found it to be really great. I've really enjoyed working with this deck in that context, and I think, having a watery deck for a lunar practice makes a lot of sense. I have been using the deck with 2 cards per spread position. So what would be kind of a 3-card spread becomes a 6-card spread for me because I will put 2 cards per position. This is something that I like to do a lot of the time with a lot of different decks, but I find it really helpful with this one because I find that putting 2 cards per spread position helps to decenter the keywords. It helps to lead me and my kind of interpretive process in a different kind of a direction than just going straight to a keyword, as one I think can sometimes be tempted to be when they're on there. Thinking about the cards in relationship, I find really enhances reading with this deck. 1 card per spread position, I think it can, with some of the cards, especially the ones where the keywords are very suggestive of a particular kind of interpretation, can feel a little bit limiting, but 2 cards per spread position seems to really work against that limitation, I think, for me personally. So overall, I'm really happy that I engaged in this deep dive process with this deck. I'm glad that I've added this deck to my collection. I'm really enjoying working with it. I find that it's a supportive deck, and I will say that it seems to read for me particularly well with reference to kind of more watery questions that deal more with kind of emotional life or spiritual life than anything else. So that is how I've been enjoying using this deck. If you have this deck, if you have thoughts to share about it, please do, leave a comment in the comments below. This is my first kind of deck deep dive video that takes this kind of format with kind of different, we'll say, chapters to the deep dive video, looking at the deck in different kinds of ways, looking at different ways to get to know a new deck, with this deck as an example. If you liked this format and you would like to see more deck deep dives from me that take something like this structure, let me know in the comments below as well. I've had a lot of fun filming it. I definitely have decks in my collection that I would like to do something similar for. Not necessarily all the same things, not necessarily always a deck interview or always a breakdown of the suits, but whatever the kind of deck suggests, right? So if you like this format, do let me know, because that will be good encouragement for me to make more. I thank you for watching and for sticking with me in what I have no doubt is going to turn out to be a pretty lengthy video. I wish you a good day, a good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are and when you're watching this. I will see you in the next video. Have a good one. Bye.